All right, Leviticus 23, let's call this one rest because that comes right out of verse 24 where it reads, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, you shall observe a day of solemn rest." And that is with regard to the Feast of Trumpets. But the Feast of Trumpets is only one holy day noted in this chapter, which starts quite simply with one we've seen. It's going to come up on a weekly basis, and that's the Sabbath rest that he has mentioned a number of times at this point to the people of Israel. But this is going to mention not only the Sabbath day, where it's going to say in verse 3, you shall do no work, in regard to the Passover that starts in verse 4, going down to verse 8. Verse 7 is going to note, on the first day you shall have a holy convocation, you shall not do any ordinary work. Not so much for the Feast of First Fruits that goes from verses 9 down through about 14, but for the Feast of Weeks, which goes from verses 15 down to 22. Verse 21 is going to say, and you shall make a proclamation on the same day. You shall hold a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. It is a statute forever. We've already seen verse 24 regarding the Feast of Trumpets, but also with regard to the Day of Atonement, something we studied just a few chapters ago. That goes from verses 26 down to 32. But verse 31 will say, you shall not do any work. It is a statute forever. And it's also repeating what was said in verse 28, you shall not do any work on that very day, for it is the Day of Atonement. And then finally with the Feast of Booths, going from roughly verse 33 down to the end of the chapter. Verse 34, no, verse 35, I'm sorry, is going to say, on the first day shall be a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. And so over and over again, that's literally what it's going to talk about. And quite simply this time, it just reminded me that not only is this a conversation about days of rest, just so people can get a break, but your boss can give you a day off just so you can be at least somewhat mentally capable of going back to work the following day. But when we see God talking to the people of Israel about making sure they have enough rest, it's not simply making sure they have enough so that they can go back and do work. Pharaoh, before he got really upset with them, seems like he might have given them some time off just so they can be more effective, but he didn't love them. And so ultimately what we see when we see God simply using this as a foundation for what he's promising in the new covenant for a more permanent rest that's symbolized by the rest they'll get when they get their own place in the land of Canaan. We're talking about a God who actually loves them and loves us. See, people who love you care about your well-being. The work isn't the point. In a lot of ways, it's similar to what we see in the difference between the old covenant and the new covenant. See, the laws were never the point. And so when Jesus summed them up, especially as we mentioned in maybe a chapter or two ago, the fact that when he was healing in violation of what the Sabbath laws seemed to be, he understood the fact that the people who were suffering on the Sabbath were really the point for the rules. And so when the Pharisees and the other leaders tried to interpret what the Sabbath rules should mean to be able to keep everybody safe from the penalties they were starting to see taxed on people like Nadab and Abihu, who offered up the strange fire. And a few chapters later, we've already mentioned the man who's going to be killed or stoned for picking up sticks on the Sabbath. And trying to keep people safe, they went too far, and they forgot the compassion that was basically the foundation for the rule. And that's what Jesus was reminding people of when asked to sum up the law. He said it's all about love. And so ultimately, when likewise, the apostle or the writer of Hebrews is reminding us that these rules are pointing to a later rest. He's reminding us that people who genuinely love us care more about our well-being than our labor. And so when we have a good boss, we've talked about before, it's a blessing. But beyond a good boss, when we have someone who loves us enough to care about whether or not our work is killing our personal lives, then that's when we have somebody who we can count more or less as a friend. And so when we meet people who genuinely care about us beyond what we can do for them, either our labor or our obedience, then we're starting to see the kinds of relationships that reflect the way in which God genuinely cares for us as well. His best to you as you go forward in him, though.